Hello, this is Duncan McDonald with Origins Medicine, and I'm here to present a case study today about autoimmunity. So, we have a 39-year-old woman who came to our clinic, and she had a really severe case of plaque psoriasis that was basically covering her arms and legs, her torso, sort of her belly, also her back. Really red, really inflamed, had her quite self-conscious, pretty severe, and she really didn't want to take biologic drugs, immunosuppressants, because she wanted to preserve her potential fertility. She was experiencing a lot of anxiety and insomnia, and so we did a complete health history with her, as we typically do in our hour-long initial session, and we determined that we were going to do our three main tests on her, and those tests are an adrenal function test, a GI pathogen screening, and an organic acids test. And there's a logic to why we do these and the order in which we do them. And so we sent her with test kits, and the first test that we reviewed when she came back was her adrenal function test. And the adrenal function test it measures the output of the main stress hormone cortisol of the body. Cortisol is a glucocorticosteroid, and it has main functions on sort of managing inflammation in the body. Cortisol is kind of like cortisone. It also helps in terms of regulating our energy level. It's a glucocorticosteroid, so gluco meaning blood sugar, which it regulates along with insulin. Has a lot of functions in the body. And what we look for when we're looking at a cortisol, at an adrenal function test, is we really want people to be up towards the high end of these reference ranges. That's where people feel their best. And the rhythm of the output should basically follow this ratio. So people start up here at around a 24, then they kind of drop down until they're at about 1/20th of the initial value when they're going to sleep. So with our patient, we found that she was kind of up a little bit above the reference range when she woke up, and then she was dropping sort of precipitously down to the low end, and then really flatlining, like basically in the afternoon having a cortisol level that we would expect in somebody going to bed. And this disruption of the rhythm really sort of wreaks havoc on the body's ability to properly manage inflammation, and that's kind of what we're seeing here in her case. So this kind of disruption can be caused by any number of stressors, and that could be emotional stress, it could be inflammatory stress, which she clearly has, it could be an infection, which leads us to our second test here. And this is our GI map test. Now, let's pull that back up. The GI map is a gut pathogen screening, and it's what we call a PCR test, which means it's doing a DNA analysis. It's a stool-based test, and we test 3 separate bowel movements because parasites and bacteria are not necessarily shed in any given bowel movement. And so we got hers back, and initially on this first bit, we see different pathogens that are common, and those were all negative. So things like Salmonella, Giardia, Cryptosporidium, things like that can really cause problems. H. pylori, a very common stomach infection, which leads to inflammation, was negative. But when we get down here under opportunistic infections, we see that Citrobacter, Klebsiella, sort of a high infection. And this is very common infections associated with autoimmunity. So this is a really big red flag when we're reviewing her case. And then when we look under parasites, we see some other stuff has come up, like Endolimax nana, which is kind of a bad little bug that can poke holes in the gut lining pretty easily, causes a real problem in some people. She's got some Candida overgrowth. And then SIG-A is secretory IgA. This is the protein that kind of shores up the gut lining. And when secretory IgA is low, that means that immune barrier of the gut is low, and proteins and toxins and whatnot can leak across the gut lining, causing an immune reaction. And this is very common in autoimmunity. 80% of our immune function is in our gut. And so when we're looking for an autoimmune condition, the gut is where we should look. And the measure of secretory IgA gives us a real sense of what's happening in terms of that gut barrier. It also looks like the Klebsiella infection that she has may be antibiotic resistant, so that's the kind of thing that we take into account when we are putting together a treatment. Now, following that, we did an organics test on her, and the organics test measures organic acids, which are the byproducts of many physiological functions, and they can be measured in the urine, and that gives us an idea of what's happening with the physiology of many systems of the body. It can tell us about energy production, inflammation. It can measure neurotransmitter activity, tell us what's happening in the brain. It can tell us nutritional status, detoxification status, the liver pathways, methylation. We get a lot of information from this test. This is like the test where all of my patients should do this once a year. It lets us know where the ship is sailing, basically. And we see that with her, there is some fatty acid and energy production issues. That means that her body is having a hard time taking fatty acids, pulling them into the cell, and going through the energy production cycle to make energy. And that cellular energy is what really powers everything in our body, including our immune function. So that's something that we'll have to take into account. And then interesting, our patient was suffering from anxiety and also some insomnia. And we see her neurotransmitter markers. So homovanillate and 5-hydroxyindyl acetate are really markers for dopamine and serotonin. And when they're elevated like this, it shows a real increased turnover. It's basically the sign of a stressed brain. And there are very specific protocols for dealing with that. Kynurenate shows that there's some inflammatory aspects happening in the brain as well. Then she has some oxidative stress markers, which we would expect with the amount of tissue damage and inflammation that's happening from her plaque psoriasis. So that's something that we really want to support the body on so that it's not going through all this oxidative stress with the tissue breakdown. And then once again, these bacterial markers kind of point to those infections that we saw with the GI map test. And it basically shows the toxicity that those infections are putting onto the liver, the burden that's on the liver. Now, we're not going to really get into this now, but we look at each of these individual acids, and they're measured on a quintile basis. And this is where the human brain becomes important, because it's about pattern recognition with this stuff in terms of what's really happening with the body. And it's our advanced studies in this that makes us really able to put together really targeted and tailored plans. So then when we think about all this and we look at our body systems here, we see that, she had an adrenal function issue and a neurotransmitter issue. So I separated both of those tiles, and so we would need to address those with an adrenal plan. There's some pathogens present and some leaky gut. She has some inflammatory issues, which we know clearly from her skin. And then a lot of oxidation of tissue, which needs to be addressed as well. So then we look at how we stage this as a treatment plan. So basically, we would be starting her with an adrenal program, and that runs for about 6 months. And that is based on the labs, to normalize the output of cortisol and DHEA in the body. This begins the real calming and anti-inflammatory and soothing aspect of the program. And this really has to go on for a couple of months before we start to kill those infections. So at about month 2, we start our GI pathogen clearing program. And the reason we wait that long in order to do that is that if that immune function, that secretory IgA in the gut, is not stabilized and healthy, it can be very hard to clear these infections. And when the body is in a really stressed out physiology, the clearing of these infections, the killing off of them, can sometimes cause side effects that cause us to pause the program. Now, interestingly, with her, when we started her GI clearing, she had a real flare of her skin, which really pointed to the connection of those infections and her autoimmunity. And so this is where the specialized skills of our practice came into play, because we were able to put her on a custom Chinese herbal formula, which very quickly dropped the inflammation in her skin and got her symptoms under control. In fact, she had about an 85% clear of her skin just from that. She was really excited. And that gave us the room to be able to proceed with the GI pathogen clearing without having to pause the program, which was great. Following that, we move on to some GI repair work, and this is where we're looking at restoring the gut lining, stabilizing the immune barrier in the gut, and repopulating with proper probiotics, adjusting the biome. This can go anywhere from 2 to 6 months, depending on the severity of the damage to the gut. And then finally, we end with some detox work, especially in her case, where there's been a lot of tissue damage and a lot of infections. And this takes the burden off of the liver and basically allows her to stabilize. So this was a great case. She was extremely happy. We were extremely satisfied as clinicians. It really sort of it was just a really great case to work on, and she had resolution of her symptoms. We corrected the underlying issue, and she was basically able then to move on to a minimal maintenance program. So anyway, this has been Duncan McDonald with Origins Medicine, and I am really thankful to be able to present this case to you guys, and I look forward to presenting more cases to you in the future. So thank you for your attention.